The Echo in the Attic, Chapter 1. The Box of Secrets. The attic air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the lone shaft of sunlight, slicing through a grimy window pane, illuminating an archaeological dig of my family's past. My mother, Patricia Parker, at 82, was finally, reluctantly, clearing out the clutter she'd accumulated over a lifetime in this old San Diego house. And I, Elizabeth, her only daughter, was the designated archaeologist. It was a Saturday, humid, even for San Diego, and sweat trickled down my back as I wrestled with another stack of yellowed newspapers. Then I saw it. Tucked away beneath a pile of old photo albums, in a corner I hadn't yet explored, was a small, unassuming wooden box. It wasn't locked, just closed with a simple brass clasp, tarnished with age. Curiosity, a familiar companion in this house of quiet secrets, tugged at me. My mother was downstairs, watching a rerun of some classic movie, oblivious. I lifted the lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were letters. Not just any letters, but correspondence from a time before me. Their paper was thin, fragile, the ink faded, but the elegant cursive script was undeniably my mother's youthful hand. My heart gave a strange flutter. This was her, but not the mother I knew. This was a younger, perhaps more vulnerable Patricia. Beneath the letters, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small, sepia-toned photograph. It showed a young woman, strikingly beautiful and terribly sad, holding a tiny, swaddled infant. Her eyes, even in the faded image, held a profound sorrow. And then I saw it. My mother, no doubt. But the baby, who was this baby? My fingers trembled as I reached for another item beneath the photo. It was a birth certificate. The official seal was faint, the ink smudged in places, but the crucial details stood out with horrifying clarity. Name: Daniel Murphy. Date of birth: April 12, 1965. Mother: Patricia Evelyn Miller. Father: unlisted, Daniel Murphy. April 12, 1965. My breath hitched. I was born in 1970. This child, this Daniel, was 5 years older than me. My mother, a baby. Before me. How could this be? A wave of dizziness washed over me, the dusty air suddenly suffocating. My mother. She had never, not once, mentioned a son. A brother. My brother. The silence, the absolute, unwavering silence of 5 decades, pressed down on me. It wasn't just a secret. It was an omission of an entire life. A life that, by all accounts, had existed. I delved deeper into the box. There were more letters, all addressed to my dearest Daniel, filled with a raw, agonizing love. Lines like, "I miss you every moment, my sweet boy, and I hope they are kind to you," tore at my heart. There were also old newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed, reporting on an adoption agency's activities in the late 1960s. One article, circled in faded red ink, spoke of the growing need for loving homes for children born out of wedlock. Another, smaller clipping detailed a specific adoption from that year, a baby boy named Daniel, placed with a family in Oregon, the Murphys. My hands shook, the documents rattling faintly. My mind reeled. Oregon, a whole life, a whole person, out there, my brother. I closed the box, the lid falling with a soft thud that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet attic. The sunbeam had shifted, leaving the corner in shadow. The air felt colder now. I clutched the box to my chest, the weight of its contents suddenly immense, a tangible representation of a hidden sorrow, a buried truth. How could I confront her? How could she have kept such a monumental secret? My mother, the woman who had raised me, loved me, celebrated every birthday, every achievement, had silently carried this immense grief, this profound absence, for half a century. And I, her daughter, had been entirely, utterly unaware. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Truth. The box remained in my possession for 3 days. It sat on my nightstand, a silent, accusing presence. I tried to act normally around my mother, bringing her tea, discussing her favorite soap operas, but every glance at her fragile, aged face felt like a betrayal. How could I ask? How could I shatter the carefully constructed peace of her twilight years? But how could I not? The weight of the secret grew heavier with each passing hour. It wasn't just her secret anymore. It was mine. A secret about a life, a brother, that demanded to be acknowledged. Finally, on the 4th evening, as she sat in her armchair, crocheting a perpetually unfinished blanket, I approached her. My voice felt strangely thick, like it belonged to someone else. "Mom," I began, my hand still gripping the wooden box behind my back. "I was cleaning the attic, and I found something." Her needles paused. Her eyes, usually so soft, narrowed almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed her face. "Oh? What did you find, dear?" Her voice was steady, too steady. I placed the box on the coffee table between us. The simple wooden surface seemed to hum with unspoken histories. She looked at it, then at me. Her expression was unreadable. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In the old chest, under some albums," I said, my own voice wavering. "Mom, who is Daniel Murphy?" Her hands, still clutching the crochet hook, began to tremble. The yarn slipped from her fingers, unraveling silently onto the carpet. Her face, usually pale, drained of all color. She looked suddenly terribly old. "Daniel?" The name was a ghost on her lips. I don't know anyone named Daniel." It was a lie, a blatant, desperate lie. It hurt more than I could have imagined. "Mom," I pressed, my voice firm despite the ache in my chest. "I found his birth certificate and letters from you to him, saying you loved him, saying you missed him." I pushed the box slightly closer to her. "He was born in 1965, before me. He's my brother, isn't he?" She flinched as if struck. Her gaze dropped to the box, then darted around the room as if seeking an escape. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. "Please, Elizabeth," she finally choked out, her voice raw with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Don't ask about this. It's in the past. It's over." "Over?" I cried, frustration bubbling up, mixing with my pain. "Mom, he's a person. He's my brother. How can it be over if he's out there? Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep him a secret?" Tears welled in her eyes, silent and swift, tracing paths through the fine wrinkles on her cheeks. She shook her head, a slow, desolate movement. I couldn't, Elizabeth. It was too hard, too painful. I couldn't." She rose from her chair, her movements stiff, and retreated into the dim hallway. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Just leave it alone." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the living room with the silent box, the unraveling yarn, and the gaping hole of a newfound, devastating secret. The wall of silence around Daniel Murphy was thicker, more impenetrable than I could have imagined. My mother, the gentle woman who had always been my anchor, had become a stranger, trapped in a past she refused to acknowledge. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Past. My mother's refusal to speak only fueled my determination. The more she recoiled, the more I felt compelled to uncover the truth, not just for myself, but for Daniel. He deserved to know. I deserved to know. She deserved to be free from this burden. Armed with the scant information from the birth certificate and the newspaper clippings, I began my own investigation. The internet became my constant companion. I started with Daniel Murphy's birth date and the Murphys in Oregon mentioned in the article. It was a needle in a haystack, but a starting point. Adoption records from that era were notoriously private, especially before the digital age. I knew it would be a challenge. I spent hours sifting through online archives, historical society forums, and even old phone directories. My days were a blur of searching, cross-referencing, and dead ends. My mother remained withdrawn, her eyes often distant, her silence a heavy shroud around her. She ate little, slept fitfully, and often stared out the window, lost in some unseen memory. I found a breakthrough, small but significant, in an online genealogical forum. Someone had posted a query about the Murphy family, asking about a child adopted in 1965. The poster's name was listed as Oregon History Buff. I messaged them immediately, explaining my situation, carefully omitting my mother's name, simply stating I was searching for a long-lost family member adopted into the Murphy family in Oregon. Days later, I received a reply. Oregon History Buff was a local historian in a small town in Oregon, intrigued by my story. He confirmed that a family named Murphy, who had adopted a son in 1965, had lived in their town. He even provided an old address and, more importantly, a name that matched: Daniel Murphy. He had since moved, but the historian had a general idea of the region he'd settled in. My heart pounded. Daniel, a real person, not just a name on a piece of paper. The historian, a kind man named Arthur, gave me more than just information. He gave me a sense of hope. He suggested I check public records in the larger county where Daniel was believed to have moved. This led me to property records, then to tax records, and finally, after weeks of painstaking work, to a current address: a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of a quiet town called Ashland, Oregon. My heart leaped with a mixture of excitement and profound anxiety. I had found him. Now what? The idea of simply showing up on his doorstep felt intrusive, almost cruel. How would he react? Would he be angry? Confused? Would he reject me? Would he want to know about the mother who had given him away? The questions swirled in my mind, a chaotic storm of possibilities. I hesitated for days, pacing my living room, the address clutched in my hand. My mother's frail silence weighed heavily on me. She never asked about my search, but her eyes, when they met mine, held a deep, unarticulated plea. A plea for understanding, perhaps, or a plea to just let the past remain buried. But I couldn't. I felt an unstoppable pull, a profound need to connect the fractured pieces of our family. Finally, I made my decision. I booked a flight. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Daniel, and in a strange way, it was about my mother. Her buried sorrow, her unspoken pain, demanded acknowledgement. Perhaps, through finding Daniel, I could finally begin to heal the wounds that had festered in our family for so long. Chapter 4: The Cold Shoulder. The flight to Medford, Oregon felt endless. Each mile stretched the anticipation, tightening the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The landscape outside the window changed from the sprawling urbanity of Southern California to the rugged, grave beauty of the Pacific Northwest. Ashland was a charming town, nestled amidst rolling hills and lush forests, a stark contrast to the sun-baked familiarity of San Diego. I rented a car and drove towards the address Arthur had given me. The roads were winding, lined with tall pines and oak trees, the air crisp and cool. The house was modest, set back from a quiet road, a small, well-tended garden in the front. A single pickup truck was parked in the driveway. My heart pounded against my ribs. This was it, the moment I had been working towards, agonizing over, for weeks. I took a deep, shaky breath, straightened my shirt, and walked up the gravel path. I knocked. A solid, decisive rap against the wooden door. Silence. I waited, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. I knocked again, a little louder this time. The door finally opened, slowly, revealing a man standing in the threshold. He was tall, with a rugged build, his hair a salt and pepper mix. His face was weathered, with deep lines around his eyes, but his gaze, when it met mine, was sharp, almost piercing. He looked familiar. Not like my mother, not directly, but there was a subtle curve to his jawline, a certain set to his eyes that hinted at a shared lineage. He was my brother. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Unsmiling. "Mr. Murphy?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. "Yes?" He didn't offer a name, just a curt acknowledgement. "My name is Elizabeth Parker. I believe we might be related." His eyes, which had been wary, now hardened. A flicker of something. Recognition? Dread? Passed through them, quickly masked. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture defensive. "Related?" he scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "I don't think so." "You've got the wrong house." "No," I insisted, stepping slightly closer, my resolve returning. "I don't. Your birth certificate, it says your mother's name is Patricia Miller." "My mother is Patricia Parker. She was Patricia Miller." His face, which had been stoic, now tightened further. His jaw clenched. He stared at me, his eyes devoid of warmth, filled instead with a chilling blend of anger and something akin to contempt. "Look, lady," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested. My mother is Martha Murphy. Always has been, always will be." "I know she adopted you," I stammered, rushing my words, trying to get it all out before he shut the door. "I know you were adopted in 1965. My mother, she was very young. She didn't have a choice. She never forgot you. She kept letters, photos." He cut me off, his voice rising, a sharp, dismissive edge to it. "I don't have a mother. Not the one you're talking about. I have the mother who raised me, the one who loved me, the one who kept me." He emphasized the last word, a deliberate, painful jab. "Your mother gave me away. She threw me out. She made her choice 50 years ago, and I made mine. I want nothing to do with her, or you." He took a step back, his hand reaching for the doorknob. "Please," I pleaded, my voice cracking, tears stinging my eyes. "Just listen. She suffered. She suffered her whole life. She carried this secret alone. She's sick now. She's old. She wants to. I don't care what she wants," he roared, his face contorted with raw, suppressed fury. "I don't care about her suffering. What about my suffering? What about growing up knowing you were unwanted? What about knowing you were a secret, a mistake?" His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "No. Go away. Leave me alone. Leave us alone." And with that, he slammed the door shut. The sound echoed in the quiet afternoon, a definitive, brutal finality. I stood there, stunned, tears now streaming freely down my face. The rejection was absolute, a physical blow. The hope that had sustained me, the quiet belief that he would understand, that he would want to connect, shattered into a million pieces. The coldness in his eyes, the venom in his voice, it was more than just anger. It was a deep, festering wound, one that had clearly never healed. My brother. He wanted nothing to do with us. Nothing. Chapter 5. The Unseen Wounds. I drove away from Daniel's house in a daze, the scenic beauty of Ashland now blurred by my tears. The rejection was a heavy cloak, suffocating and chilling. I had envisioned many scenarios for our first meeting. Surprise, confusion, even cautious curiosity, but never this raw, unyielding hostility. He didn't just refuse. He actively despised the very idea of a connection. I checked into a small motel, the kind with floral bedspreads and a pervasive smell of stale coffee. The room felt sterile, unwelcoming. I stared at my reflection in the dim bathroom mirror, my face streaked with tears, my eyes swollen. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I had built up such hope, such a powerful need for this reunion, and he had shattered it with a single brutal slam of a door. My phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated, then answered, my voice thick. "Hi, Mom." "Elizabeth? Is everything all right? You sound tired." Her voice was soft, laced with her usual concern. The urge to break down, to tell her everything, to share the crushing weight of Daniel's rejection was overwhelming. But I couldn't. Not yet. She was too fragile. The truth, delivered so harshly, might break her completely. "Just a long drive, Mom," I managed, trying to inject some cheer into my tone. "Oregon's beautiful. I'll tell you all about it when I get back." "All right, dear. Just wanted to check on you. Be safe." "I will. Love you. Love you too, sweetie." The conversation ended, leaving me feeling even more isolated. The silence in the motel room pressed in, amplifying the ache in my chest. I knew I couldn't leave things like this. I had to try again, even if it was just to leave a letter. He deserved to hear our mother's side of the story, not just his own painful interpretation. The next morning, I drove back to Daniel's house. The pickup truck was still there. I wrote a quick, heartfelt note, pouring out my sorrow, my hope, and a plea for understanding. I included my phone number, my email, and a promise that I would respect his wishes, whatever they may be. I slid the envelope under his door, a small white flag of surrender and persistent hope. Then, with a heavy heart, I began the long drive back to San Diego. The landscape, once so full of promise, now seemed to mock me with its indifferent beauty. When I returned, my mother was in her armchair, looking even more frail than when I had left. Her eyes were sunken, and there was a tremor in her hands. The moment she saw me, her gaze searched my face, a question hanging unspoken in the air. "Mom," I said gently, sitting beside her, taking her thin, cool hand in mine. "I found him, Daniel." Her breath hitched. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and a desperate, fragile hope. And what did he say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. He knows. He knows you're his birth mother. He's angry, Mom. Very angry. He said he wants nothing to do with you, or with me." The words, though softened, hit her like a physical blow. Her face crumpled. Silent tears, heavier and more profound than any I had seen before, streamed down her cheeks. Her body shook with silent sobs, a deep, guttural grief that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "Oh, Daniel," she choked out, the name a painful lament. "My poor boy. My poor, poor boy." I held her, rocking her gently, feeling her pain as if it were my own. This was the moment I had feared, the consequence of unearthing decades of buried sorrow. But as I held her, something shifted. The dam, so long holding back a torrent of unspoken emotion, had finally cracked. "I didn't have a choice, Elizabeth," she sobbed, her voice raw with an ancient grief. "I was 17. My parents, they were so strict. My father would have disowned me. My mother, she would have been heartbroken. I had no money, no job, just a child myself. I thought it was the only way, to give him a better life, a stable home." Her words poured out, a lifetime of suppressed anguish. She spoke of the shame, the fear, the secrecy, how she had carried Daniel in secret, hidden away in a distant relative's home, fearing judgment, fearing the ruination of her family's reputation. How the day she gave him up had been the darkest of her life. A piece of her soul torn away, leaving an emptiness that had never, not once, truly filled. She spoke of haunting dreams, of wondering if he was safe, if he was loved, if he knew how much she had truly suffered, how much she truly loved him. Every birthday, she whispered, her voice hoarse, I would light a candle for him, imagining him, wondering what he looked like, what he was doing, and every year the guilt grew heavier. But I was so scared, so ashamed, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell anyone. Her confession, so raw and vulnerable, broke my heart. The cold, distant mother who had clammed up at the mention of Daniel was gone, replaced by a woman consumed by a lifetime of guilt and unshed tears. The pain in her eyes was profound, a reflection of the unimaginable sacrifice she had made, a choice born of desperation and the rigid societal norms of her time. I saw not just a mother who had kept a secret, but a young woman trapped by circumstances, making the hardest choice imaginable. I held her until her sobs subsided, until she was just a small, trembling weight in my arms. The conversation, though agonizing, had brought a strange, fragile relief. The truth, finally spoken, hung in the air, heavy but no longer hidden. We had unearthed the wound, and now, perhaps, we could begin the long, arduous process of healing. But the question remained, would Daniel ever allow that healing to include him? Chapter 6, A Daughter's Curiosity. Weeks turned into months. My mother's confession, while emotionally draining, had also brought a subtle shift in our relationship. The wall between us had crumbled, replaced by a shared understanding, a quiet empathy. She still carried her sorrow, but now she carried it openly, allowing me to share its weight. We often sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes with her recounting fragmented memories of Daniel, her voice soft with longing. Daniel, however, remained silent. No phone call, no email, nothing. The small white envelope I had left under his door seemed to have vanished into the abyss of his resentment. The hope that had flickered after my mother's confession began to dim, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment. His rejection, though painful, was firm. I understood his anger, the deep-seated abandonment he must have felt, but it didn't lessen the sting of his refusal to even listen. Then, one brisk autumn afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. An Oregon area code. My heart leaped. Could it be Daniel? I answered, my voice trembling slightly. "Hello? Is this Elizabeth Parker?" A young woman's voice, hesitant but clear. "Yes, it is. My name is Sarah Murphy." My breath caught. Sarah Murphy, Daniel Murphy. Could this be? "I'm sorry to call you out of the blue," she continued, "but I found a letter addressed to my father, Daniel Murphy, tucked away in an old book. It had your name and number." "Your father? Daniel Murphy?" I stammered, the words catching in my throat. You're his daughter?" "Yes," she said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "And your letter mentions something about a birth certificate and a Patricia Miller. I don't mean to pry, but it sounds like you might be a relative. My father, he's always been very private about his adoption. He never talks about it. But your letter, it was very compelling." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. Daniel had a daughter, and she was curious. She was open. This was a lifeline. "Sarah," I said, my voice filled with a newfound energy. "Thank you for calling. Yes, I am related. Daniel is my brother. My mother, Patricia, is his birth mother." There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence as she processed the information. Then, "Wow, okay, so you're my aunt, and your mom is my grandmother?" Her voice was filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Biologically?" "Yes," I confirmed, a small, hopeful smile forming on my lips. "My father, he never talks about it," she repeated, "but I've always been so curious. I mean, it's a huge part of his story, of our story, isn't it? He just shuts down if I even bring it up." "He shut me down too," I admitted, a flicker of pain returning. "When I went to see him, he was very angry. He didn't want to hear anything." "I can imagine," Sarah said, a note of sympathy in her voice. "He's been hurt, I know. But is she okay? Your mother, I mean." My birth grandmother?" "She's old, Sarah," I replied, "and she's been carrying this secret, this grief, her whole life. She's sick with it in a way. She just wants him to know that she never forgot him, that she loved him, that it wasn't a choice, not really." "Can you tell me more?" Sarah asked, her voice eager, almost pleading. "Everything I need to understand. I need to know my family history." And so I told her. I recounted the discovery of the box, my mother's initial refusal, her eventual, tearful confession. I spoke of the societal pressures, the crushing shame, the desperate choice. I spoke of Daniel's harsh rejection and my own pain. I painted a picture of a young woman, trapped by circumstances, forced to make an impossible decision. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I tried to convey the depth of my mother's lifelong sorrow. Sarah listened intently, interjecting with gasps of surprise and exclamations of sympathy. "My poor dad," she murmured at one point, "and my poor grandmother. This is heartbreaking." "It is," I agreed, "but there's a chance, Sarah. A chance for healing, for understanding, if he would just listen." "I'll try," she promised, her voice firm with newfound determination. "I don't know if I can convince him, but he needs to hear this. He needs to know what she went through. Maybe it's not too late." Hope, a fragile, persistent sprout, began to push through the hard soil of my despair. Sarah, a conduit, a bridge. Perhaps through her, Daniel might finally open his heart, just a crack, to the echoes of a past he had so fiercely tried to silence. Chapter 7. The Bridge Builder. Sarah became my confidant, my ally. We spoke almost daily, long, heartfelt conversations that spanned hours. She was a revelation, bright, compassionate, and fiercely loyal to her father, but also deeply curious about her own roots. She was a journalist, a storyteller by nature, and she recognized the profound, heartbreaking narrative unfolding before her. "He's a good man, Elizabeth," she told me one evening, her voice soft. He's so guarded. He built walls around himself, I think, to protect himself from that initial pain. He doesn't know how to let them down." She spoke of her attempts to broach the subject with Daniel. Each conversation was a delicate dance, a slow, tentative probing of his defenses. He would get quiet, then deflect, then finally his eyes would cloud over with that familiar anger. But Sarah was persistent. She didn't push aggressively, but she gently nudged, offering small pieces of the story I had told her. "I told him about the letters, Aunt Liz," she said one day, using the familial term that still brought a lump to my throat. How Grandma Patricia kept them, how she wrote to him even after he was gone. He didn't say much, just stared at the TV, but I saw something in his eyes, a flicker. Then came the bigger breakthrough. Sarah sent me a text message late one night. He asked to see a picture of her, of Patricia. I showed him one of her when she was young, from the bots. He looked at it for a long time, didn't say anything, but he didn't turn away. A picture, a silent acknowledgement. It was a minuscule step, but it felt like a monumental leap. He asked about her health. Sarah texted a few days later. He said, "Is she really sick?" I told him she was old and frail. He just nodded. The walls were not crumbling, but they were developing cracks. Small hairline fractures, but cracks nonetheless. My mother, sensing the shift, seemed to rally. The spark of hope in her eyes grew brighter. She would ask about Sarah, about Daniel, her voice filled with a yearning that was almost unbearable to hear. "Does he know I loved him?" she would whisper. "Does he know I never stopped?" "Sarah is telling him, Mom," I would assure her, holding her hand. "She's telling him everything." Finally, a call came from Sarah. Her voice was trembling with excitement. "Aunt Liz, he said he'd consider meeting you. Both of you. But it has to be on his terms. Here, in Ashland. And he wants it to be short. No drama." My heart soared. A meeting, after all this time. It wasn't an acceptance, not yet, but it was an opening, a chance. "When?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Next Saturday," she said. "Just for an hour, at a quiet diner in town. I'll be there too, for support." The logistics were quickly arranged. My mother, despite her frail health, insisted on going. "I have to see him," she declared, her eyes burning with a fierce determination I hadn't seen in years. "I have to tell him myself, before it's too late." The drive to Ashland felt different this time, less fraught with the painful anticipation of rejection, more imbued with a nervous hope. My mother sat beside me, quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the passing scenery, but I knew her mind was miles away, preparing for a moment she had dreamed of and dreaded for 5 decades. We arrived in Ashland under a soft Oregon drizzle. Sarah met us at the diner, her face a mixture of apprehension and excitement. She hugged me warmly, then turned to my mother, her gaze respectful, almost reverent. "Grandma Patricia," she said softly, extending her hand. My mother, for a moment, seemed speechless. She took Sarah's hand, her eyes welling up. "Sarah," she whispered, a tremulous smile touching her lips. The connection between them was immediate, unspoken. A balm to my mother's weary soul. We sat in a quiet booth at the back of the diner. My mother sat opposite the door, her gaze fixed on it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. My own heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then the door opened. Daniel stepped inside. He wore a simple plaid shirt and jeans, his face unreadable. His eyes swept across the room, then landed on us. For a long moment, his gaze met my mother's. It was a silence filled with 50 years of unspoken words, of pain, of longing, of anger. He walked towards our table, his steps deliberate, his expression grim. Sarah rose and gave him a quick, reassuring hug. He nodded, then turned to us. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely audible. He ignored me, his eyes still fixed on my mother. Chapter 8. A Fragile Bridge. The air in the diner thickened with unspoken history. Daniel stood before us, his posture rigid. His face a carefully constructed mask. He looked at my mother, an old woman now, frail and trembling, and a flicker of something undefinable. Not warmth, not exactly, but perhaps a grudging curiosity crossed his features. "Daniel," my mother whispered, her voice choked with emotion, her hands reaching out instinctively, then faltering, dropping back to her lap. "My boy." He flinched at the endearment, a sharp recoil. "Let's be clear," he stated, his voice low, controlled, but laced with a simmering resentment. "I'm here because of Sarah, and because she told me you're not well. I'm not here for a reunion. I'm here to listen, and that's it." His words, though harsh, were a small victory. He was listening. My mother took a shaky breath. Her eyes, filled with tears, never left his face. "Daniel," she began, her voice gaining a surprising strength, a raw, unflinching honesty. I know you hate me. I understand why, for 50 years. I have lived with that knowledge, and with the shame, the guilt, the unspeakable pain of losing you." He shifted, his gaze flickering away for a moment, then back to her. "I was so young," she continued, her voice trembling now. 17. My parents, they were good people, but so strict. In those days, a girl unmarried with a baby, it was a scandal. It would have ruined them. It would have ruined me. Her voice broke. "I had no money, no place to go. I loved you, Daniel. From the moment I felt you inside me, more than anything. But I was terrified, truly terrified." She reached for a napkin, dabbing at her eyes. They told me it was for your good, that you deserved a family, a stable home, a life I couldn't give you. They said it was the only way, to give you a future. I signed the papers, and it was like signing away my soul. Every day since then, I've wondered if you were happy, if you were safe, if you were loved. I never stopped loving you, Daniel. Never. Not for one moment. She looked at him, her eyes pleading, raw with a lifetime of anguish. "Please, believe me, it wasn't a choice of giving you away. It was a choice between two impossibly painful paths. And I chose the one I believed, in my terrified, desperate youth, would give you a chance at a better life. I was a child myself, facing an impossible situation. Daniel listened, his face impassive, but his eyes, though still guarded, seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scoff. He just listened. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly, reached out and gently touched her father's arm. "Dad," she murmured. "She really did suffer. Aunt Liz told me everything. It wasn't just a simple decision for her. It was a nightmare." Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, devoid of its earlier aggression, but still laced with deep-seated pain. "I grew up knowing I was adopted, knowing I was given away. It leaves a mark, a feeling of being unwanted. No matter how much my adoptive parents loved me, that feeling never quite went away. I always wondered why I wasn't enough, why I was easier to part with than to keep." My mother whimpered, a soft sound of agony. "Oh, Daniel, no. You were more than enough. You were everything. It was me, my failings, my weakness, not yours." He shook his head, a slow, weary movement. "I don't know," he said, his voice trailing off. He looked from my mother to me, then back to Sarah. The raw anger was gone, replaced by a profound weariness, a deep-seated sadness. "I need time," he finally said, his voice raspy. "This is a lot to take in." "Of course," I said gently, finally daring to speak directly to him. "Take all the time you need. We wanted you to know the truth." He stood up, his gaze still distant. I have to go." My mother's face fell, a flicker of renewed despair. But then, as he turned to leave, he paused. He looked back at her, his eyes unreadable. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible, for telling me." And then he walked out of the diner, leaving us in a stunned silence. Chapter 9. Seeds of Hope. The silence that followed Daniel's departure was heavy, but different. It wasn't the crushing silence of complete rejection, but a fragile, uncertain quiet. My mother's shoulders slumped, but she wasn't crying. Her face, though still tear-streaked, held a strange, serene expression. "He listened," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "He actually listened." Sarah, ever the optimist, beamed. "He did, Grandma. That's a huge step. He wouldn't have come if he didn't want to know. He's processing. It's a lot for him, too." I felt a cautious optimism. The ice around Daniel's heart hadn't shattered, but it had cracked. He had heard the truth, unfiltered, from the very woman who had given him up. He had seen her pain, her remorse. It wasn't about instant forgiveness. It was about the seeds of understanding being planted. The next few weeks were a period of watchful waiting. Sarah became our invaluable link. She would call, telling us about Daniel, slowly revealing more about his thoughts and feelings. "He's quiet," she reported one day. "He's thinking. He asked me to send him more pictures of Grandma Patricia, especially from when she was younger. And a picture of you, Aunt Liz. He wants to see the resemblance." This was another profound shift. He was actively seeking information, acknowledging the physical connection. A week later, Sarah called again, her voice hushed with excitement. "He asked about her favorite flower and her favorite color. He's thinking about her, Aunt Liz. Really thinking." My mother, who had been fading, seemed to gain a new lease on life. The hope of connection, even a tentative one, infused her with a renewed sense of purpose. She would spend hours recalling memories, not just of Daniel, but of her own youth, the innocence lost, the dreams shattered. It was as if finally speaking her truth had unlocked other memories, other stories that had been buried beneath the weight of her secret. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived at our doorstep. It was addressed to my mother in a neat, unfamiliar handwriting. My heart hammered as I opened it. Inside, nestled among tissue paper, was a small, beautifully crafted wooden birdhouse, painted in soft blues and greens, and a card. The card was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. Patricia, it read simply. My mother always loved birdhouses. She said they were homes for lonely souls. Maybe this one can be a home for yours too. My mother held the birdhouse, her hands trembling. Tears streamed down her face, but these were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. He remembers, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He remembers his mother. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was an acknowledgement, a fragile, tentative olive branch extended across decades of silence and pain. It was a recognition of her suffering, a validation of her existence in his life, however brief, however painful. Chapter 10. The Unfolding Canvas. The birdhouse stood proudly on our porch, a quiet testament to a fragile connection. There were no more dramatic breakthroughs, no tearful reunions. Daniel remained in Ashland, guarding his space, his privacy. But the bridge had been built, brick by painstakingly slow brick, by Sarah, by my mother's raw honesty, and by Daniel's own quiet internal processing. He started sending small, unsigned notes to my mother, always through Sarah. Questions about her childhood, vague memories he had, requests for details about their shared past. And my mother, her heart overflowing, would pour out her stories, her answers, her love, onto pages I would send back to Sarah. It was a cautious dance of reconnection, a gradual unfolding of a lifetime of unspoken truths. One day, Sarah called, her voice thoughtful. Dad was looking at old photos of Grandma Patricia today. He told me, "She looks so much like you, Sarah." And then he added, "And like Elizabeth." He sees it, Aunt Liz. He finally sees it. The resemblance, it wasn't just physical. It was in the resilience, the quiet strength that ran through our lineage. Months turned into a year. My mother's health began to decline more rapidly. The toll of her age, and perhaps the emotional marathon she had run, was finally catching up. She was confined to her bed, weaker, but her spirit remained bright, fueled by the knowledge that Daniel knew, that he was listening. "Do you think he'll ever truly forgive me?" she whispered one afternoon, her voice thin. "He's trying, Mom," I assured her, stroking her hand. "He's trying to understand, and that's a start. That's everything." One crisp morning, Sarah called. Her voice was somber. "Aunt Liz, Dad wants to know if he can visit, just to see her." Before, her voice trailed off, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. My heart ached with a mix of joy and profound sadness. It was coming, the full meeting, but it might be too late for a complete, healing reconciliation. Daniel arrived 2 days later. He came alone this time, his face etched with a quiet intensity. He walked into my mother's bedroom, a man who had been a ghost to her for 50 years, now standing in the flesh. My mother's eyes fluttered open. She saw him. A gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He stood by her bedside, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his rigid posture softened. His eyes, usually so guarded, filled with a deep, complex emotion. Patricia, he said, his voice rough. Hello. It wasn't an embrace, it wasn't a hug. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a simple word, spoken across the vast expanse of time and pain. But in that single word, I heard not just his name for her, but a lifetime of buried thoughts, of silent questions, of a tentative opening. He stayed for an hour, sitting by her bed, listening as my mother recounted fragmented memories, her voice weak but clear with the urgency of her story. She spoke of her regret, her love, her constant wondering. Daniel listened, his gaze fixed on her, occasionally nodding, sometimes looking away, but always, always listening. When it was time for him to leave, my mother reached out a frail hand. He hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, gently, he took it. His large, calloused hand enveloped her small, thin one. "Thank you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for coming." He squeezed her hand, a brief, firm pressure. "You're welcome," he said, his voice low. "And thank you for everything." He released her hand, nodded to me, and left the room. My mother watched him go, a profound peace settling over her face. She closed her eyes, a soft, contented sigh escaping her lips. The journey was not over, but a crucial step had been taken. The canvas of their lives, once fractured, now held the beginnings of a new, complex, and painfully beautiful portrait. The echoes in the attic had finally found a voice, and a fragile bridge had been built, offering a glimpse of a future where forgiveness, perhaps, could finally bloom.